Welcome everybody to our November session of the Discovering History seminar. My name is Dr. Emma Robertson and I'm Associate Professor in History at La Trobe University campus here in Bendigo. We've also got an audience here at the Bendigo Goldfields Library, and we also have people joining us online today, and we'll also be recording this for YouTube, and you can also find our earlier Discovering History sessions if you've missed any on our YouTube channel through the Goldfields Library. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are living and working here in Australia. Many of us are probably here today on beautiful Jarrah country in Bendigo. I'd like to pay my respects to our elders, past and present, and extend a special welcome to any First Nations people that might be joining us, whether here today at the Goldfields Library or online, wherever you happen to be. And this is our programme, which is a continuing partnership between the Goldfields Library, the Bendigo Regional Archives Centre and La Trobe University. And it is our last session for 2022, but we do have a programme coming up in 2023, so do look out for that. So it's a great pleasure today to have two speakers. This is our postponed session from April, but just perfect timing for Remembrance Day coming up here in November. We've got Clayton Tremlett, who's a practicing artist based nearby in Castlemaine, Victoria. And Clayton will be discussing work from his recent exhibition, which actually gave us the title for our session today, Immortals. Clayton's exhibition finished here in Bendigo at the end of July, but he is going to be in Maryborough in April 2023. And the exhibition will be finishing up at the Shrine of Remembrance in 2024. So there's still plenty of time to catch it. And our second speaker, I'll introduce both our speakers at once, I think, and then we'll get straight into it. But our second speaker, Livia Kenney, is a La Trobe PhD student. So it's great to have a La Trobe person here today. And Liv has just had a baby not that long ago. She finished up at the Castlemaine Art Museum when the baby arrived, but she's now working at 45 Downstairs, which is a not-for-profit gallery and theatre in Melbourne as a curator. And otherwise, Liv's PhD is her main job, as it should be. Liv's studies are focusing on the role of visual culture in forming identity and on visual literacy education in diversifying Australia's self-image. So I'll hand over to Clayton first, and he'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'll give him a big wave, and we'll pass over to Liv, and there'll be some time for questions at the end. So thank you, Clayton. Over to you.
Thank you, Emma. Hello, everyone. First of all, it's important that I acknowledge the Djadja people in my country, where I live currently at Castlemaine. I acknowledge Rick Nelson and his family as traditional owners of their land there, and all past and present elders in the community. This project has taken about 5 years so far for me to undertake, and it's a project where I've been documenting the faces of all of the World War I digger memorials in the state of Victoria. It kicked off when I was taking my son to varying soccer tournaments around the state, and me noticing in small regional towns a number of memorials, cenotaphs, in varying states that really intrigued me. I have a background in art conservation. I'm currently an art teacher with Castlemaine Secondary College, but I have a background in art conservation, and some of the conditions of the memorials were really quite bemusing and concerning for me on one level, but also fascinating because a lot of the memorials, particularly the faces, the figures, have taken on lots of injuries which appear to be like war injuries. So broken noses or sheared ears, that sort of thing. Now, it's important to acknowledge in 2022, it's approximately 100 years since the dedication of most of the memorials. So I set about documenting all of the memorials, and to my count, there's about 65 in the state of Victoria. So I'm looking specifically at documenting just the face. I'm also doing a document report on the condition of the memorials overall, but specifically, I've made a photographic study and transformed the images into a series of prints. They're screen prints, and they were exhibited, first of all, at the Soldiers Memorial Institute in Bendigo for 3 months. as Emma mentioned, the show is an ongoing project, and it'll go to the Shrine of Remembrance as a complete set of works with all 65 images in it. So some of the things that really became clear to me in doing the research was that not all memorials are the same. There's a misnomer that memorials were mass produced. So I'm talking about World War I specifically, and the majority are marble figures. There are some that are sandstone, like at Wedderburn nearby, or some are cast concrete, like at not Witchy Proof, Whittlesea in Melbourne. And others, as I said, there's a lot of marble, majority of marble and sandstone in general. So when I'm going to the memorial, I'm taking documents on the condition of the marble, but also looking for the manufacturers. So back in the day, if we go back to the First World War, Gallipoli was a major event, obviously, and then there were 2 referendums to vote in conscription in 1916 and 17, both of which were voted down. So it was resolved by individual communities how to celebrate or acknowledge the massive amount of dead that would never be repatriated to Australia. And the cenotaph in a small regional community became really important. It's a symbol of the loss and grief in that particular community. So cenotaphs were generally fundraised for during the First World War, and in many cases dedicated between 1921 and 1923. So we're in that window of 100 years now. So my project was just to see what they look like and compare and contrast some of the diversity that has been instituted 100 years ago. So some of the discoveries that I've made include things like one company called Corbin and Scott in Clifton Hill. So I'll just backtrack a bit there. The way that a memorial would be produced would be more or less to advertise in the Argus or the Age equivalent in Melbourne back in the day for a monumental mason to produce these monuments. In many cases, the monumental masons were transitioning from doing gravestones fundamentally, and they didn't have the capacity or the artisans to make the figures. So they either imported a person who had the skills, and in the case of Corbin and Scott's, and some folks here, sorry for you folks at home, some folks here have the brochure that has some of that information documented in it. So Corbin and Scott's paid for a person called August Reitman to come out from Switzerland to be their fundamental carver of marble statues. And he's turned out, and this is part of the research that I've been conducting, he's carved about a quarter of all monuments in Victoria, which is a staggering effort in a very short period of time. The one, I'll just grab an image there. I'll grab 2 images and I'll put those towards the camera. That's good there. Two images by August Reitman, and you can see they're very similar. He pioneered his own style. The one on my right is at Morwell. The one on my left is at Bonnie Doon. Both of these figures were carved from marble imported from Italy, but Corbin and Scott's were a very affordable monumental masonry housed in Melbourne, but had offices around regional Victoria. So they produced lots of very small scale monuments like at Clunes, which the figure is just literally at the top of my head is the feet of the figure. So they produced monuments that cost between £400 and £700, which was a lot of money back then. Generally, with a monument from that era, you can gauge how big the monument is by how many names they had to accommodate from that regional community. So a place like Nil has an enormously tall monument and a figure that was also carved in Australia by an unknown sculptor, but they had more than 300 names to put on their monument. So all of the images that I've got here are available on my website. You can scroll through and they're all titled there. The thing about a monument like that, it would cost a lot more to produce the monument. So it's somewhere between £700 and £900 to make. And in many cases, it necessitated the importation of a figure from Italy. And this is part of the research, and it is just a fact that I would suggest more than 50% of the memorials that have marble figures have Italian figures at the centre. Now, they're carved to represent, in many cases, Australian soldiers, and there are 6 women also in different poses, but I'll talk about that in a minute, and Liv will talk about that in more detail as well. But the thing, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. The thing about the Italian side of it. Okay, so because there was a shortage of skilled craftspeople, it was cheaper to import a figure from Italy. And now many were carved at Carrara by Carrara craftspeople, and therefore you have a lot of Italian soldiers in places in Victoria. Okay, so they're characterised as Italian soldiers. Here's an example. So in Benalla, I grew up in Wangaratta. So at Benalla, you have this figure, which is more or less an Alpini soldier. Okay, quite a different hat. It doesn't look anything like the hats that the soldiers were issued with in World War I. Okay, so this figure was imported from Italy, and many like it often have Italian sergeant stripes, which are inverted to the English stripes. So I've come across some indicators that are quite fascinating in that they're not necessarily honouring Australian soldiers, but they were produced because they were a commodity that was sought after at the time. Now that's a bit controversial in itself, that so many, about 50%, do have this characteristic to them. A local monumental mason, who's one of only 2 still going in the state, so Lodge Brothers in Melbourne are still a monumental masonry company. In fact, they made the Shrine of Remembrance back in the 1930s. The other one is J.B. Wilson of Bendigo. J.B. Wilson use, as the majority of monumental masons use, Harcourt granite for the pedestal. That's a very common feature across the entire state. But Wilson's, and I have inquired with them for any historical documents. Unfortunately, they've lost everything up until about 40 years ago. But J.B. Wilson's always imported their figures from Italy. And the telltale sign there is at the back of each of those figures, you will see a stump. And a stump is a very common device used in Italian sculpture to give support to the ankle so it's not vulnerable. Imagine how easily it would be to break a marble figure if it's just its weakest points are its ankle. So a stump was a device to assist with strength. But at the back of the stump for all Wilson's monuments is an acorn leaf. Now, an acorn leaf is not Australian, but it's also very symbolic. So there's lots of little details here and there that you can pick up that work with Australian history, but have been imported as symbology for us. So I'll just have to go to my notes because I'll forget. If you're looking for J.B. Wilson monuments, there's one in Charlton, Tooborac, not far from here towards Heathcote, Watcham, Apollo Bay, and Quambatook. And the one at Quambatook is a bugler as well. So there are 6 buglers across the state, and bugler, I find the bugler interesting because there's an unknown symbology around, is it a call to arms or is it a last post that's meant to be symbolising? In most cases, the buglers are characterised as Italian soldiers as well. Okay. In the research that I was conducting for this project, it came to light that when platoons came across an obviously underage enlistee, 14, 15 in some cases, they made them become the buglers because they were less likely to have to fight or be in physical conflict. So they're often assigned the role as bugler to minimise that impact on them, but also their ability to be impactful in a setting. Okay. So how are we going for time? 5 minutes, great. So, this is a good transition to what Liv's going to talk about. There are 6 figures of women across the state. Now, one company from Footscray called Thompson's commissioned an Italian company to make 3 of those monuments, and they're all very similar. I'll get you one image. That's okay there? So this image is of the figure at sail, okay? And this figure, like the other 2, are symbolic of victory. So this figure is looking towards the sky, holding the world in their hands. There's a bronze component to this marble figure, and you can see the quality of the marble, even though it's aged over 100 years. It's not cracked or it's not decayed in any way. It's still in pristine condition, which I have to marvel at after 100 years. Nonetheless, this is a common symbol for women when they were characterised in monuments. The other symbology is in a state of remembrance. So they're either looking to the heavens in a form of victory, or looking to the ground, often holding a peace frond and symbolising remembrance or despair about the loss. These figures, some of these could have been carved in Australia because they're quite similar in character to what you might see in cemeteries of the day, but they're much larger and much more detailed. So they're the smaller versions of, they're smaller sculptures than the larger victory images, but there are 6 across the state. I don't have an image to show you of Jeparit. Jeparit is kind of a real anomaly in that I think Jeparit is an image of a nurse because they're characterised as a very ordinary person. Now, most of the symbology for these figures is meant to either be heroic or sad or have some characteristic for us to reflect upon. I think the figure at Jeparit might have been modelled on an actual person. Okay? But I haven't got any evidence of that. So my research goes into small historical societies. You probably need to know that back in the day, the RSLs didn't exist, that all the fundraising that was done for monuments, dedications or construction were mostly done by women's groups back home and fundraised for during the war. So in many cases, like with Margaret Baskerville, who was a famous sculptor of the day, in Melbourne circles, she produced 2 large bronzes, one for Maryborough and one for Alexandra in bronze. I said bronze, but they're oversized figures. They are 1.5 size actual life, whereas most of the figures that you see in these small communities are all about life size or 3/4 life size. Okay? So there's lots of variation. There's no consistency. There's individual communities' involvement in how those images were produced. The last image I'll go back to, and for you folks who have the brochure there in front of you, this standard character, which most people associate with as the ANZAC digger in Victoria, it looks very much like the man who carved it. So I suspect he's made a lot of sculptures in his own likeness, having had a shortage of a model back in the day, but he also was quite fond of putting a little A patch. Now, an A patch is not uncommon as an ANZAC emblem from the day, but his name was August. So lots of his sculptures have his little signature on the arm, and that helps me identify that he's made these because they all kind of line up, and he's made a number of different styles of them. Some in a state of looking down and repose, some looking directly out at the audience with a soft stare into the distance. Okay, does that feel like an overview of what I've been doing? As Emma mentioned, more of the images will be in Maryborough, so another additional 8 will be printed and added for the Maryborough exhibition, and then the complete set will be in the Shrine of Remembrance in April 2024. Okay. Over to Liv. Over to Liv.
Thank you. That was such an interesting project. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen. Hopefully people can see my PowerPoint that I've got up there. Emma, does that look like it's, yep, awesome. Okay. So before I start, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm doing my presentation from, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and pay respect to their elders past and present. And I want to thank Clayton because that was really interesting. I think it's a fascinating project and it's really exciting to be able to talk about this today. This is the sort of thing where a PhD student gets to just ramble on about their own research, and it's really nice to have an audience of people who are engaged and interested. So today I'm inspired by Clayton's Immortals project and exhibition, and I want to talk about the way that the image of the ANZAC evolved from the earlier Bushman as hero Australian archetype and the role that the feminine has played in the construction of both. So Australia's national identity is so closely linked to the image of the ANZAC soldier. And it's hard sometimes to see where women might fit into that picture. So I want to explore that question. And as well, I want to look at visual literacy and the recontextualisation of these sort of monuments to manhood that have such a significant presence in our public art landscape. How can we start to understand these statues as monuments to real men and women, real experience, and often real grief for these communities? So for the past couple of years, I've been involved with a group called A Monument of One's Own, whose primary purpose is to fight for statue equality. So that is, we're campaigning for equal representation of women in public spaces. We're actually given some funding earlier this year by the state government for our first series of monuments to women to be installed across Victoria. The first is going to be a statue of Zelda de Prano. She was a women's rights campaigner, and she campaigned she gained her notoriety in 1969. She chained herself to the Commonwealth Building in Melbourne to protest pay inequality. That's going to be up hopefully early next year, I think, which is really exciting. It's going to be at Trades Hall. So for this project, my primary contribution was gathering statistics about statues in Melbourne and in regional Victoria. And it became clear very quickly that there were two fundamental issues around representation of women in public spaces. The first is that there are just very few women represented anywhere. There aren't many statues of women around. The second issue is that where women were present, they were often allegorical. So Clayton touched on this already. Their bodies and faces were being used to represent values, ideals, or concepts. We know that the purpose of monuments, particularly when we're talking about bronze or marble statues, is the immortalization and veneration of their subject. We create larger than life figures to instill a sense of reverence and wonder, to memorialize an event or a person or a group of people. This is a few images from Clayton's project. And it feels really heartening in the context of our discussion tonight to know that Clayton's project and his Immortal series includes 6 images of women. At least 3 of these, I hope I've got this right. There's 2 of them here that represent remembrance and 1 that looks like she represents victory, which it sounds like is correct. This isn't surprising to me. In my research, I found only 6 statues of actual historical women in public spaces in Melbourne. As a side note, if anyone knows of any more, get in touch and let me know, because we're always trying to gather information. So when I was looking into statues of women in Victoria, I also found 16 statues of women being used as symbols for a range of different things, including commemorating servicemen and women in World War I, temperance, domesticity, motherhood, many others. Allegory and the use of women to represent values or concepts, including those of a nation state, is a practice that goes back beyond the establishment of white Australia. So the French have Marianne, who symbolises their republic. The British have Britannia. The Americans have what is probably the most famous statue of all, the Statue of Liberty. In Australia in the 1880s, there was a conversation happening around the use of a woman's image to stand in for the nation, but they weren't having much luck. Minerva seemed like she might be a good option. She's the goddess of wisdom, justice, law, victory, and sponsor of arts, trade, strategy. She's basically, she covers all of your bases. But as American Bulletin cartoonist Livingston Hopkins said, in the early days, whenever we had an occasion for a goddess or other personification of Australia, we found Minerva rather difficult to acclimatise. So their solution was to create the character of the little boy from Manly, described as a child striding with innocent absurdity into the adult public world. Australia was not an adult nation yet. As Clayton puts it in his exhibition brochure, Australia was still a fledgling nation at the outset of World War I. And this is a really important element of the story because we were still trying to understand who we were. Other nations had a strong sense of self and images of women to represent that, but Australia couldn't decide on one. And that space allowed for images of men to stand in as representatives of the best of the nation. The feminine was essential to the construction of this Australian male archetype. Central to my research is the importance of visual culture to the development of a national identity. In the context of Australia, this has manifested as the Australian Bushman as hero character. The earliest constructions of an Australian national identity evolved through the creation of imagery and literature that connected the colonising male to a new harsh landscape. In the visual arts, we often talk about the work of the Heidelberg artists as the first truly Australian art that began to present Australia as it really was. But the Heidelberg works from the 1880s and 1890s draw on the earlier characterisation by Henry Lawson, among others, of Bushmen, pioneers and settlers. These Australian men were rough but kind, capable and hardworking. They were awkward around women, but they loved their families, and their sense of honour was tied to their work on the land. It was through this struggle to tame the land that a man could shed his identity as a Briton abroad and earn his new identity as an Australian. It's not a coincidence that these humble but strong men are not unlike the ANZACs that we know, and I'll touch on this a little later on. So where are women in this emerging national mythology? For my PhD research, trawling through colonial art collections, I have seen many pictures of women's bodies. There are women luring men into the sea, and there are women up to their bloomers in the waves. There are women blowing hot winds through the desert, and others are sitting on the moon. Occasionally women will get lost, a bright white spot against the mixed greens and browns of the bush. These women's bodies represent a sailor's fear of the ocean, the leisure afforded by men's hard-won economic successes, and a hot and unforgiving landscape that presented the struggle against which white Australian masculine toughness was born. What these female bodies rarely represent is actual women. Put very simply, the earliest constructions of an Australian identity were framed around men taming or claiming ownership of the land, which was framed as feminine. It's here that we see the first examples in the Australian context of women as metaphor, as a symbol. In the visual arts, this was presented in painting, drawing, and it's also present, obviously, in sculpture, statues, and monuments. Now let's look at the shift to ANZAC as representative of Australian national identity. Federation and the years leading up to it had seen a growing sentiment in Australia that the history of the nation was worth preserving. But while archives were being built, there was still a sense that the story of the nation was yet to be written. Participating in a world war in the early years of the 20th century provided an opportunity to shift the narrative from Australia as a penal colony to Australia as a noble nation worthy of global recognition. And it feels necessary just to quickly note here that women's suffrage had actually already put Australia on the global map, but that's for a different talk at a different time. In his writing about the war, C.E.W. Bean, Australia's official war correspondent and the instigator of the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, very specifically connected the image of the ANZAC to the earlier masculine constructions of the typical Australian. He said of the ANZAC, so far as he held a prevailing creed, it was a romantic one inherited from the gold miner and the bushman, of which the chief article was that a man should at all times and at any cost stand by his mate. This was and is the one law which the good Australian must never break. The idea of mateship, the love of one man for another, is repeatedly referenced in our education around the ANZACs and in political and public discourse around what are considered to be our shared defining characteristics as Australians. As I said, it's not a coincidence that the ANZAC looked a lot like the earlier Australian male archetype. The different versions of the digger in monuments across the state, both as a stoic soldier and the young man full of regret and doubt, indicate to an Australian audience the same sense of courage. There was very much a sense that these young men, some still boys, had made the courageous decision to go to war, and their defeat at Gallipoli added to the narrative of naive sacrifice. We connect the ANZAC myth to the myth of the frontier, a place of mateship and men, where women existed at a distance only as mothers, wives, and nurses whose purpose was to support the real heroes. There's some debate around how significant the mythology of the ANZAC was throughout the mid-20th century. But we can be sure that from the 1980s onwards, at least, the concept of the ANZAC as representative of an Australian identity was gaining traction. It became part of our national history curriculum. In 1994, Paul Keating said at the burial of the unknown soldier at the Australian War Memorial, "He is all of them and he is one of us." It's undeniable that the ANZAC is central to our understanding of ourselves as Australians. Notably, in the sculpture garden at the Australian War Memorial, there are only two figures that are women. One represents patriotism and the other represents war. The Australian Servicewomen's Memorial is an abstract sculpture with no figurative elements. When I was writing this talk, Google Docs suggested that I correct servicewomen's to servicemen's, which I think speaks very loudly to the issues that we're covering. In the decades following the war, statues were appearing across the country as monuments to the soldiers who'd fought for Australia, and occasionally the women who'd enlisted as nurses as well. For communities who had sent their young men off to war, these monuments were a way to remember and honour their brothers, their sons, their husbands who died so far from home. In her book, Making Australian History, Anna Clark makes the point that it was easy for Australians in those early days post-war to attach themselves to the ANZAC, the digger, as their emblem of Australianness because of its connection to the everyday. The grief and loss that these monuments represent were felt keenly within these communities, as was the need for a place to gather and mourn. That doesn't negate, though, the way in which the ANZAC has been used politically to direct Australians towards a sense of national identity that clings tightly to a masculine idea of nation building. While women had taken on a range of different roles in the war effort, including as nurses and medical professionals, but also keeping the economy running at home while raising the next generation of Australians, when they are immortalised in bronze or stone, there is so often a sense, to again use Clayton's words, of reflective remembrance. That is the idea that women existed in relation to men and not as agents in their own right. Men did go and fight the war, but women kept the nation going. And when men returned, women were expected to sink back into the role of homemaker and give their jobs back. Women's role was significant, but it hasn't been memorialised as such, and the use of their imagery as allegory, more often than as historical subjects, reinforces for a contemporary audience the story of the noble ANZAC. For a contemporary audience, these monuments form a public archive that combines with our national historical and political discourse to tell the story of the ANZAC as a masculine image of the nation. This brings us to visual literacy and the ways that we see and engage with artworks. If we're going to use visuals to represent or to present an argument or to tell a story, whether that's through the creation of a monument or a painting, then our audience must be literate in that language. And research has found that in the most part, they're not. Visual literacy became a popular area of research in the 1970s, 1980s, when museum and gallery educators began to consider the ways in which audiences engage with exhibitions and material and visual culture. Conceptions of visual literacy began to incorporate cultural literacy, so the understanding of social and cultural context, both of the exhibition and the artworks themselves, and the museum literacy, understanding how to navigate the institution and understanding how the institutional context can affect the presentation and the reading of an artwork. This applies as well to works in public spaces. One of the key researchers in this area was Abigail Housen, whose framework for what she called aesthetic development would become fundamental to education programming in some of the world's most significant visual arts organisations. In her research, Housen asked a really important question. What is the experience of someone engaging with art for the first time? And what she found was universal. When someone without experience encounters art for the very first time, regardless of age, gender, demographic, they have an immediate sensory and emotional response that draws in elements of their own knowledge, preferences, and biases. Then they weave these surface level observations into an egocentric narrative. The capacity to hear new voices by considering the artist's intention or cultural, social, and historical context comes after much more experience with the artwork. Housen uncovered two other important facts. One is that this beginner level visual literacy applies to most gallery visitors. So that is, people who are choosing actively to engage with art. And the second is that no amount of extra didactic information allows us to skip that first stage. If we want audiences to genuinely engage with artworks and images in ways that look beyond the surface, we have to meet them where they are. One way that we can do that is through recontextualization. So, recontextualization, does it work? Only sometimes. When we talk about recontextualizing our public statues and monuments, so often what is proposed is adding a plaque with a caveat, or maybe we put an information board next to the object. We include extra details about the history of the person, the place, the event that's being memorialized. And this is a really logical starting point. If the objective is for our audience to gain a deeper understanding of what they're looking for or looking at, then extra information seems like it would help. Makes sense. But there are a couple of issues with this approach. The first is that the debate around the removal of statues has become so politicized that, we see even federal ministers talking about removing a statue as being akin to Stalinism or the burning of books by the Nazis. So there's not really a way to have that conversation without it sort of being overtaken with this political bent. And secondly, these approaches don't take into account what we know about visual literacy, that we bring our cultural understanding to an image or an artwork, and that we make a judgment or create a narrative that incorporates our own sense of self within a matter of seconds after looking at the work. Clayton's work through his Immortals project is actually, for me, a great example of recontextualization that can make a difference because it incorporates those principles of visual literacy really effectively. Abigail Housen's work emphasises the importance that time and reflection play in the later stages of what she calls aesthetic development. So stages 1 and 2 are where most of us sit in terms of our visual literacy. Stage 1 is that quick look that we all take initially, and stage 2 is the development of a basic framework, asking questions about perceived skill or quality of the work. So that's the sort of my kid could do that, or my kid couldn't do that kind of example. From stage 3, the classifying stage, viewers start to develop a more sophisticated interpretation through the application of any art historical knowledge they might have, by rationalising interpretations and applying ideas about meaning and message. And by stage 4, the interpretive stage, viewers are spending time letting symbols and meaning reveal themselves, responding more intuitively to the artwork. When we walk past these statues of ANZAC soldiers, we might take the time to quickly glance at them and read the inscription on the plinth. We might even take in details like the figure's uniform or other clear symbology, although based on the fact that a lot of them are Italian, it turns out I have not been paying that close attention. But it's very rare for us to actually take the time to reflect, get up close and consider the person or people beyond the image. Understanding that people viewing these statues are often not spending a lot of time up close, Clayton's work actually does that for us. He's spent the time getting to know these men and women and has created works that allow us to see them in a different light as individuals with stories of their own. The context in which Clayton's work is viewed is also really interesting as an element of the project, shifting the image from this monumental statue in a public space to works on paper exhibited in a museum setting. Cultural codes dictate that for those of us immersed in Western patriarchal culture, which is all of us, the image of a bronze or marble man on a pedestal will, at least for now, communicate to us that we are in the presence of greatness. The image of a woman in robes on a pedestal will, at least for now, communicate to us that we are seeing the personification of a value, an ideal, or a concept held in high esteem by or being bestowed upon a society where men take the lead. Therefore, removing this monumental context allows us to put down that preconceived sense of awe and start to see the humanity in the faces of these men and women. When we consider these men as brothers, sons, and husbands, we can start to think about the women who were left behind to keep things moving at home, who missed them when they didn't return, or when they returned as men changed by war. In regional centres, these were so often the women who gathered together and mobilised the power of their grief to build these monuments and establish this public archive that we now use as stand-ins for our sense of masculine national identity in the form of the ANZAC soldier or the woman who revered and served him. So there is a significant value in seeing these subjects as human beings. It opens up the possibility of a history filled with complex and diverse communities. The introduction of the museum setting is a really interesting one, and I'd love to actually hear more from Clayton about how he feels that his images were received and maybe viewed differently as a consequence of their location. Art museums and gallery settings can be really intimidating spaces for audiences, but I wondered if the role of the Soldiers Memorial Institute and Military Museum as a social history museum space added to the sense of these images as a historical archive telling a human story. I'd be really interested to hear Clayton's thoughts on that. So the last little section with this image here, I was saying so often the absence of images of women, and especially actual historical women, means that as a researcher of women's representation, I actually spend a lot of my time talking about men. So I want to finish today by bringing us back to the question of women's representation in the story of the nation. It's really hard to tell women's stories when we don't have images of them as historical subjects rather than objects, especially in our public spaces. This absence highlights the need for visual literacy education. Our public spaces tell and venerate the stories of men engaging actively in the process of nation building, whether that's statues of colonising colonels or gold miners or ANZAC soldiers. They also occasionally tell the story of women as otherworldly, connected to our national story through their support of the men who are doing the real work. For me, the work that Clayton has done through his Immortals project presents a really useful example of the way that when done well, the recontextualisation of images of men can also bring women to life. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Liv, and thanks everybody online for their patience. You got that twice, but you know, good value. So yeah, we'll take some questions now. I'm going to try and manage this as best we can. Do we have a roving mic or not? Is it this one, or I can repeat?
Should pick up everyone.
Should pick up everyone. Yeah. Okay. If not, I can always repeat the question. But yeah.
Thanks. Look, it was hard to bridge the two portions, but I'll try and do so in the Bendigonian context, because there are half a dozen sculptures of women in the Bendigo Art Gallery, which are Carrara marble, sculpted here in Bendigo by an Italian sculptor in the 1880s, 90s, 900s. Cagliari, I think was the name, or something similar. Now, they are all of women in various states of nudity, which is confronting now. And they were donated by civic leaders at the time, who would never have dreamt in 1,000 years of having their wives or daughters so displayed on the public arena as these women are. But it was equally an idealisation of the female form at the time, and it was not seen as disrespectful at the time. Now, they may not last very much longer here and now, but there was an active sculptor of Italian descent memorialising women in what was then the gold context. And that deserves some respect and some recognition, which I think might have just passed one by. So there is a Bendigonian concept of acknowledging women, perhaps not in the way we like, But then the latest sculpture in Bendigo is of St Mary MacKillop in the most prominent position in the city,
cathedral.
at the entry point. Marvellous modern piece and so on. So that it's not correct to imply a general overarching disparagement of women in the Australian context. It's just that they're not recognised in the form that they were going. Now, can I just go back?
Yep.
I found, Clayton, that was marvellous, particularly your reference to the Alpini uniform. Remember, of course, that Italy was on the same side as Australia in that particular phase of the Great War. And that would not have been too foreign for us, particularly with the signal. I'm just surprised that there's been such good nick, because the Western Front Association, active here in Bendigo, has been recording all the avenues of honour and so on. I'd love to meet in with you. But the deterioration of some of these works in the public arena, I'm just wondering if you would expand upon what may be necessary to preserve what's already there.
Clayton, do you want to come up to the microphone perhaps and just answer that?
I'll answer a couple of points you made in a minute, Liv. I've shown you some examples which are in fairly good condition, and in general those sculptures like Sail are Carrara marble, and that is considered the best marble on the planet. Other marble often used by Australian sculptors came from Queensland, and it's not the same character, and it once water penetrates the surface of marble, it crackles all over, and so it becomes little crystals, and bit by bit they erode, and once they become soft, then they become quite brittle. So a sculpture like at Avenel has lost pretty much all of its face, and a bit of its face is just literally eroded away. So the quality of the marble has a big say in how long a sculpture will last in the Australian conditions. Obviously, we've got extreme heat and lots of water at various times. So there's limited, I've worked in repairing monuments in a different capacity, and some monuments that I've documented for this project have had, particularly buglers, have had arms replaced entirely. And it's only when you look closely at some of those objects that you see how much repair has been attempted at various times. And in many cases, how crude that is, and it could be refined. But people are doing the best they can with what they've got locally, generally, because this wasn't money until more recent times to conserve that sort of public sculpture. Does that make sense?
Should we move to put them in more secure and climate control?
I don't think so. I think it's 100 years, and there's so much more that I could talk about in the fact that when most of them were dedicated, they were in the centre of town, and many had to be removed because there was a transition from horse-drawn carts to cars, and people couldn't drive very well, and lots got broken. So they had to be reassembled. So let's say the one at Footscray was smashed into tiny pieces and been reassembled entirely. So I think it's important to acknowledge, and that's a statue of a woman too, from that same group, from the Thompsons. So yeah, I think they're important as they are and need to be honoured for who they are.
Exactly. There is a question online, if you want to respond to that, so people can hear me very well. But yeah, we've got a question from Sophie just about, how much discussion or debate there was around what the image would actually be, which I think is a great question. I don't know if you can answer with the sources.
Tough one to answer without being there in the room, but I think I mentioned that a lot of the committees were founded by women, and they were quite adamant on what sort of sculpture they wanted, and then it was sent out to tender. So I can give an example here. In Maryborough, where the exhibition's going to, the Women's Patriotic League fundraised and paid for that monument, and were insistent that Margaret Baskerville, a very credited sculptor of the day, was the commissioned artist to make that. And the thing that I learned through this process, which it really astounds me, is Margaret Baskerville as a person is 4'11". And she made these incredibly oversized bronze figures all by herself and carved the all of the stone plinths entirely. A sculptor's sculptor. And that the Women's Patriotic League were insistent that they had her do that project, I think is really commendable. And that's going to be part of that exhibition, as an emphasis on that aspect of how that monument came to be. Yep.
And can I just add a point to that I think was interesting, sort of looking into this with my research, that it's actually the regions should be really commended for this as well, because what I seem to find was that when you look at the development of war memorials and statues that are marking, you know, World War I, World War II in capital cities, often the first version of a statue or a monument would include women, and then it would slowly get changed and become a bit more masculine, and we just put a few more men in, we just take this woman out. And it was, you look at the regions, and actually I think that it's really interesting to see the way that they sort of made decisions about what they were going to depict. The women were often, as we've both said, in the room making the choice, and they were respected and their decision was respected, and they were really using imagery that was relevant to them at the time, that meant something really personal, because I think it's really important not to lose sight of the fact that these were sites of commemoration and places for people to grieve and mourn what was a really significant loss.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
One thing that not many people know is at the time of the outbreak of First World War, the east coast of Australia, from all the way from Adelaide through up to Sydney, was suffering amongst the worst droughts that had been recorded. So you've got a situation where Australia as a fledgling country is farming, and most farm workers can't earn any money. And so there was this whole push towards volunteering, because you'll be paid more to go and have an adventure, as it was sold, more than not have a job at home. So it's a significant part of the history of the volunteering that I think the government got completely wrong back in the day, when the conscription side of stuff was being forced upon, and everyone voted no. They said no 2 times over.
Another question.
Two comments, just to comment on what Clayton just said then. It was also interesting that the soldiers themselves in the battlefield, but the majority voted against conscription. And you would think it would be the opposite, but if you put yourself in the position of the soldier, would you rather someone with you who volunteered or someone who was forced to go? But my not so much a question, but a comment. I find it fascinating that from what you said, it's the women's groups who mostly were responsible for getting the statues together.
Yep.
So their perception then, obviously very different now, they actually put the men on pedestals themselves, whereas the women attitudes today would be seen quite differently. And coming back to Howard's point about the way statues were perceived before then was even fascinating.
That's right, it's evolved. And if we went through that exercise again, it would be completely different.
Yes.
A small point to the side there is one side effect of the loss of men as breeding stock was that Australian heights diminished after the First World War appreciably, and it took 2 generations to regain that height, because so many men of particular stature were forced, well, not forced, they went to the war, and we lost that whole generation. Some people weren't allowed because they were not tall enough.
Which was followed by the second generation. From a farming perspective, you're rather than survival of the fittest, your breeding stock, you lost your best breeders, to be blunt, the First World War, then Second World War, a similarity.
Yeah. So back to Liv's point that she made earlier, I think you've covered it really well, Liv. I've tried to take the context away from the memorial into the personal by documenting the faces and looking specifically at that, because as a conservator, I'm looking at faces closely and deciding what I'm going to do about conserving them or repairing them or washing them or whatever. So it's about taking away all of that political side of stuff, which has happened since the 1980s, and just looking at what we have, because people generally don't really look up at those memorials very often other than ANZAC Day currently. So it's an opportunity to just reflect on, well, what did happen 100 years ago and what do we have as these symbols, these allegories?
Yeah.
Very quick.
Oh yeah,
question.
quick question,
I
Jordan.
was just interested in what you were saying about the reimagining of the Australian identity during the First World War, away from what was a colonial and digger idea to the military idea, and we're not only making the identity more masculine, but have you found that it moved away from the old working class ideal of, in terms of the nation building happening, say at Eureka and the Red Ribbon Rebellion and the miners rebelling against the upper class, and then going on to the idea that, well, actually the working class are the soldiers and that they have fought to defend this kind of a bit more of a monumental idea. I'm just wondering whether you found anything interesting about that as well.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting point. I mean, military history is not my area of specialty, but I think that what's fascinating in the Australian context is that we sort of maintained throughout, like you said, this idea of the kind of primacy of the working man, and that it was the working man who went to fight. And I mean, I look at World War II and my grandfather, I mean, he was always a Union man, and he went to fight in World War II and he came back and stayed a Union man. And I think that that's a really interesting element of the Australian experience, and that national identity. We see ourselves as that still, I think. You know, you look at contemporary imagery around Australian national identity, and it still is drawing on agriculture and farming a lot, and working in factories, and this sort of working man kind of idea. Yeah, I would be fascinated actually to compare it, because I wonder if in other places it's quite as important to maintain that sense of, you know, of classlessness that we think of ourselves as having.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks everybody. And I think I'm sure you'll join me in saying it's a really interesting combination of papers. And I think for me, it's been bringing back, as you say, those people and the people behind those faces on the statues. And I love the way that both of you were sort of encouraging us to look at those in a different way, to think about the human stories behind those. So thank you so much for that. Those of us here in Bendigo are lucky that we do have some prints here we can look at, but as you say, you must have ones online. So thank you so much. That is our final session for 2022, but we will be back. I think March will be our first session of the year, and looking at drought.
Yeah, the
long dry. So do join us for that. Thank you so much, and thanks for those of us online as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.